I had had enough. 4 years, HOA Karen had made my life a living nightmare, from arbitrary fines to constant complaints about things that didn't matter. My perfectly trimmed hedges were too short, my mailbox was too flashy, and God forbid I parked my car at a slight angle in my own driveway. Every small choice I made seemed to trigger her wrath, and each phone call from the HOA office left me more frustrated than the last. The community that was supposed to feel like home had become a cage, and I decided it was finally time to break free. The moment I made my decision, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I began preparing to leave the HOA permanently. Packing up the little things first, the garden tools, my prized collection of outdoor lights, and boxes of personal belongings. I could feel Karen's gaze, even from across the street. She lived for control, and the thought of taking that power away from her filled me with a strange sense of satisfaction. My neighbors, who had witnessed Karen's endless harassment, gave me discreet smiles and sympathetic nods. It was almost like they were silently cheering me on, waiting to see how she would react. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the suburban street in shades of orange and gold, I loaded the moving truck with care. Karen, of course, was watching from her front porch, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line of fury. I could see her muttering to herself, probably rehearsing the calls she would make to the HOA board or worse, the police. I tried to ignore her, focusing on the sense of liberation swelling inside me, but the tension was palpable. Every glance in her direction reminded me of the power she had so carefully cultivated over the years, and how finally it was slipping through her fingers. Then, just as I was about to lift the last box into the truck, I saw her fumble for her phone. The smirk of vindication on her face was unmistakable. She was calling someone, and based on past experience, it was likely the authorities. My heart sank for a brief moment, a jolt of nervousness cutting through my excitement. But then I reminded myself that I wasn't breaking any laws. I was simply leaving an organization that had abused its power over me for far too long. Karen might try to intimidate, threaten, or manipulate, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Little did Karen know, this call was about to backfire in ways she could never imagine. The sirens that would soon approach the neighborhood wouldn't come to enforce her petty demands. They were going to witness a moment she would never forget. And the twist. The officer on the other end of her call wasn't just any cop. He was my son. As I stood there, hands on my hips, watching her clutch the phone and fume with anticipation, I could hardly contain the quiet thrill of knowing that the tables were about to turn. Karen had always underestimated me, but she had no idea that her next move would be met with authority, calm, and, most importantly, justice. By the time the first patrol car rolled down the suburban street, Karen was practically vibrating with anticipation. She clutched her phone like it was a lifeline, muttering to herself about how the HOA had rules for a reason and how someone needed to teach me a lesson. Her eyes darted toward me every few seconds, gauging my reaction, as if my calm demeanor might crumble under the weight of her righteous indignation. But I didn't flinch. I had prepared for this moment mentally for months, and there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that I was finally taking control of the situation. The police car slowed to a stop in front of my driveway, lights reflecting off the pavement in a rhythmic red and blue flash. Karen practically bounced on her heels with smugness, certain that my exit from the HOA had escalated into a situation that required immediate law enforcement intervention. She gave me a pointed look over her shoulder, a silent warning. She expected me to be flustered, to apologize, maybe even to beg her forgiveness for daring to leave. Instead, I met her gaze calmly, hands folded across my chest, the picture of serenity in stark contrast to her barely contained fury. Karen stepped forward as the officers exited the vehicle, her voice rising slightly as she began to explain the emergency. Every word dripped with self-importance, detailing how I had violated HOA rules and how she had no choice but to call the authorities. I listened patiently, nodding slightly, as though entertaining her claims for the sake of civility. In the back of my mind, a small smile lingered. Karen had no idea that this would not go the way she had rehearsed, and the dramatic irony of her impending disappointment filled me with quiet anticipation. As the officers approached, the tension in the air was palpable. Karen was practically vibrating, adjusting her stance and gesturing toward my moving truck with exaggerated indignation. I could see her imagination running wild with scenarios of citations, fines, and confrontations. But then, something shifted. The lead officer stopped in his tracks, eyes widening just slightly, a moment of recognition flashing across his face. Karen, too, froze, staring at the approaching officer as if he had suddenly transformed into a figure from a nightmare she could not escape. The smug confidence she had carried just moments ago melted into visible confusion, her words catching in her throat. The revelation hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Karen had called the police, expecting authority to back her up, but the officer she was so confident about confronting wasn't just any stranger, he was my son. The tension was electric, neighbors peeking through blinds, whispering, sensing the impending twist. Karen's carefully constructed facade of control was cracking with each step he took closer, her eyes wide as she realized that her plan to intimidate me had completely backfired. For the first time, Karen was no longer the one holding power. The tables were about to turn, and justice, wrapped in a calm uniform and the authority of my own family, was stepping onto the stage. Karen's face went pale the instant she recognized the officer walking toward her. Her smug confidence evaporated in an instant, replaced by wide-eyed shock and disbelief. She had expected someone distant, impersonal, someone who would dutifully enforce the HOA's imagined authority. Instead, there he was, my son, standing tall in his uniform, the embodiment of calm authority. The world seemed to slow down for a moment as neighbors peeked through windows and curtains, sensing the dramatic turn about to unfold. Karen's lips parted, then closed, then parted again, as if her brain was scrambling to process what she was seeing. I watched from a few steps back, a quiet satisfaction bubbling inside me. Years of petty harassment, fines, and threats had led to this perfect, ironic twist. Karen had spent so much time trying to control me that she never stopped to consider the possibility that her power could be turned on its head. My son's gaze was steady and professional, but I could see the tiniest hint of amusement in his eyes. This wasn't about personal vendetta, it was about exposing the absurdity of her behavior and letting her witness the consequences of underestimating someone. Karen tried to regain her composure, opening her mouth to spew the rehearsed lines she had no doubt practiced in front of the mirror. "This is a civil matter. You can't just," she began, but her words faltered mid-sentence as she realized that authority was no longer on her side. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her phone, the device that had once symbolized her power over the neighborhood now completely useless. She had called for backup, expecting to assert dominance, only to find herself frozen in front of the very person who would not only remain impartial but also command respect effortlessly. Neighbors began to gather at a safe distance, curious eyes darting back and forth between Karen and my son. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Isn't that his son?" "Wait, she called him." Karen's face reddened, her usual arrogance replaced with flustered panic. Every gesture she made seemed exaggerated and desperate, a stark contrast to the composed, almost statuesque figure of my son. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone present, and the power dynamic had shifted entirely in my favor. The woman who had tormented me for years was now completely at the mercy of the scenario she had created. For my part, I stood calmly, hands resting lightly on the edge of the moving truck, letting the scene play out. The tension between Karen and my son was palpable, a silent battle of authority versus hubris. Karen's fury and disbelief clashed with his calm professionalism, creating a spectacle that my neighbors would surely talk about for weeks. In that moment, I realized that leaving the HOA had never felt so satisfying. What had started as an ordinary move-out had transformed into a masterclass in poetic justice, and Karen, frozen mid-rant, was about to learn the hard way that her reign of petty terror had finally come to an end. Karen's panic quickly morphed into an all-out meltdown. Her face flushed bright red, her hands waving frantically as she tried to assert control over a situation she no longer understood. "This is ridiculous. You can't just let them leave like this. HOA rules exist for a reason," she shouted, voice rising with each word. But her words fell flat, almost comical, against the calm, unwavering presence of my son. His posture remained steady, arms at his sides, eyes locked on her as though she were a misbehaving child rather than the HOA tyrant she had long been. The neighbors, drawn by the escalating drama, began to peek through blinds and around corners. Whispers and murmurs spread quickly. "She's losing it," one neighbor said, barely suppressing a chuckle. Karen's attempts to regain composure were futile. Every gesticulation, every shout, only highlighted the absurdity of her actions. She seemed caught in a loop, unable to process the fact that the person she had called to enforce authority was actually part of my family, and far more in control of the situation than she ever had been. My son, maintaining professional decorum, spoke with measured calm. "Ma'am, this is a civil matter between residents. There's nothing for us to enforce here. I suggest you step back and allow them to complete their move without interference." His words were simple, clear, and deliberate. Yet each syllable carried an unspoken weight, a reminder that authority was now firmly aligned against her petty vendetta. Karen's flailing gestures slowed as she attempted to argue, realizing that her usual intimidation tactics had no effect. She had relied on fear and perceived power, and now, stripped of both, she was floundering in front of everyone. The tension in the neighborhood was electric. Karen's voice wavered, her sentences breaking mid-thought. "But this isn't fair. They can't do this," she sputtered. My son, calm as ever, didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch, and didn't even smirk. His presence alone was enough to disarm her, to make her realize the futility of her outburst. For the first time, Karen was the one on display, and the audience, our neighbors, watched with barely concealed amusement as her carefully constructed aura of authority crumbled before their eyes. Finally, she paused, taking a shuddering breath, realizing that her usual tactics had utterly failed. My son stepped aside, signaling politely that the matter was over, leaving Karen standing in the driveway, visibly shaken, unsure of what to do next. I could feel a rush of satisfaction as I continued loading the truck, hand steady, watching her retreat mentally even as her feet remained planted. In that moment, the years of petty harassment, fines, and threats had been repaid not with anger or confrontation, but with calm justice and undeniable authority. Karen had lost control entirely, and the neighborhood had witnessed the perfect reversal of power. Karen stood frozen for a moment longer, her shoulders slumped and her face a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. The neighbors, who had gathered discreetly along their driveways and peered through windows, exchanged knowing glances, quietly enjoying the poetic justice unfolding before them. Her frantic attempts to regain authority had been neutralized entirely by the very person she had underestimated, my son. The irony of it all wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Karen herself, and I could see the internal collapse as she realized that her years of petty power trips had finally caught up with her. With a final defeated sigh, Karen retreated toward her house, muttering under her breath about HOA regulations and the audacity of my actions. She no longer glared, no longer shouted. Her energy had been spent entirely on the fruitless attempt to assert control. Meanwhile, I continued loading the last of my boxes into the moving truck, the weight of years of harassment lifting with each item I secured. My neighbors quietly applauded my composure, some even offering smiles and nods of solidarity as the surreal scene played out. What had begun as a routine move had transformed into a public spectacle of accountability and calm triumph. My son remained professional throughout, speaking only when necessary, his presence alone diffusing any lingering tension. "Everything here appears to be in order," he stated simply, his tone neutral but firm, a subtle reminder that authority is not about ego, but about integrity and responsibility. Karen had called expecting intimidation and confrontation, but what she received instead was an impartial, competent, and respectful resolution. Watching her finally retreat, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. The HOA had lost its grip, Karen's theatrics had failed spectacularly, and justice, quiet and effective, had been served. As the moving truck pulled away from the driveway, a sense of liberation settled over the neighborhood. It wasn't just about leaving the HOA, it was about reclaiming my life from years of arbitrary rules and petty harassment. Neighbors waved and offered small congratulations, whispering excitedly about how Karen had completely miscalculated the situation. The power dynamics had shifted permanently. Where she had once ruled with intimidation, now there was only respect for reason, calm, and fairness. It was a victory not just for me, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of petty authority. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in warm shades of orange and gold, I finally set down the last box in my new HOA-free home. The ordeal was over. Karen had been confronted with the consequences of her overreach, and I had moved on to a life of freedom, free from fines, rules, and unnecessary drama. My son had done more than his duty. He had exemplified the power of calm authority over petty tyranny. And as I stood there, looking at the quiet, peaceful street, I knew this chapter had closed with a satisfying sense of justice, irony, and ultimate victory.